Hey everybody, Jim here, and I figured that I'd weigh in on this whole Brian Michael Bendis Superman thing. I saw a bunch of videos, including my man Rocky over at the Comic Boom YouTube channel that you should check out. And I just wanted to get on to kind of talk about what I think is going on with Brian Michael Bendis. And if you haven't heard, he ended up going on the Off Panel podcast on June 3rd of 2020, a couple days ago, and ended up talking about leaving Superman, that his run was heading towards an end. Now, isn't any sort of, it's almost like the idea of, oh, I think I'm dying. Well, aren't we all dying one day at a time, right? One day at a time. Where's Schneider? You end up where Brian Michael Bendis said, I'm heading toward the end of my run on Superman, so I've been more reflective on it. And I will never be more grateful than I got to heal my near-death experience through Superman and then get through this pandemic. So he's at least saying the Superman book. I think he means the super books. I think he's also talking about Action Comics. Now, the big idea is, when would he be leaving? You know, why is he leaving? These are the things that people are talking about. So I figured, what the heck? I'll talk about it as well, right? Oh my. And I want to start by saying I don't like any of the super books that Brian Michael Bendis is writing. I do not like any of the books. I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of Brian Michael Bendis, but this is actually not going to be a trash session. This is going to be more, actually, you'll kind of think I'm defending him a bit as we go through this, because the idea of him leaving, I think it's just him leaving. And I also think that there is something coming down the pike that will naturally make the idea of him leaving make more sense when we find out, as in a new status quo, a reboot, who knows what they will call it. But you end up with him saying this on the Off Panel podcast. And like my wife and her emotions and her moods, the podcast was up and down and up and down. It was up, down. Now it seems to be back up. You can go and listen to it again. It's the Off Panel podcast where all this was dropping. Now, I had heard from a friend of a friend that the reason why it was pulled down wasn't that controversial. It was the idea that all of the protests and the things going on in the real world ended up too important to have something like this interview up for the fella over at Off Panel Podcast, and thought that he didn't want to distract things. He wanted to pull that down and wait until some of this kind of goes and then put it up, so it didn't, kind of get involved with all of that. So it didn't seem like it was as controversial or, any conspiracy theory about that going up and down. Now, in the meantime, again, to talk about what is going on and why, you ended up also a couple of days ago, Brian Michael Bendis announcing that he is going to have a new villain starting in Superman number 25 in September, and a villain that was called Sin Mar in the press release, but in the quote by Brian Michael Bendis, it was called Cinnamar, which I don't like because it sounds like some sort of spice that you'd probably put on pancakes. And I hate pancakes.
Don't question me.
I hate pancakes. They're ridiculous. You don't put Cinnamar on pancakes, please. I mean, really, what are you, a rookie? So when this was announced, again, okay, I have this big villain. It's gonna rock the super world. Now, in the meantime, Action Comics is also ramping up the story about the Invisible Mafia. So if you would guess that these would be 6-issue arcs. Now, I know that might be pressing the issue, since Brian Michael Bendis in 6 issues usually, tells about a issue and a half of story, how that goes. But if it is 6-issue arc, well, then you're going to end up finishing, in 2021, around the time that Death Metal ends. Now, it would be a couple months after. Death Metal ends up being 7 issues, but they have a skip month in September. And please, if you don't think that after Death Metal we won't have a couple epilogue type issues, but I think that Death Metal is going to pave the way of a new status quo. It's going to change a lot of things, possibly the Trinity, especially because they're the ones in the book where you're going to have Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, the things might change with them, which would make a natural way for Brian Michael Bendis to leave the book. And not even just a natural way for him to leave the book. Like, oh, here you go. You can leave, Your Majesty. It's not even that. It would be smart for all the books to change their creative teams when there is a status quo change, because the status quo, you hope, is what's going to end up getting you more readers. And you also would maybe like a new number one with that, or, a new creative team, stuff like that. So Brian Michael Bendis leaving after this Sin Mar arc is done and him wrapping up his whole Invisible Mafia story in action, that makes complete sense. It doesn't seem like there would be any other reason to really question why he was leaving. Now, I did see some people talking about that they thought it would be because of sales. Oh, sales are down. The sales are horrible. They really aren't. And this is where I'm going to sound like I'm here and I'm trying to be Mr. Bendis supporter. I'm like his hype man. I'm his personal Flava Flav here, which I don't have a Flava Flav.
Where's the beef?
No, that's not Flava Flav. But the whole idea that the books aren't selling, none of the books are selling. There is a really bad thing going on at DC where some really big books just aren't selling anymore. Take, for instance, a Flash that was a huge seller and was even a better seller than what we'll get to, Peter J. Tomasi's Superman book in Rebirth. As it went down, Peter J. Tomasi's book was falling faster than Flash. Well, Flash is now at 29,000. So all of the books are in dire need of some sort of change. And I've actually said this a lot with, even the whole Joshua Williamson on Flash. It's too long. They're waiting too long to get people up, and all the sales in general are down. Now you have the COVID deal. That's going to cause even more things down. But if you do look at Brian Michael Bendis, and we'll just on the Superman book, when you ended up finishing Tomasi's run, and most people will know and get angry, is the idea that when Bendis came over, Bendis is coming. When he came over, he pretty much said, all right, Dan DiDio, it seemed to be between these two. Yeah, I'll come over if you let me write Superman. And it's, which Superman book? Why not both? And he grabbed them both and ended up making it so that the Super Sons had to be canceled because John was going to be H. Ended up at that point, the Supergirl book was canceled, then brought back. And all of this turmoil and stuff. And he did come on with a Man of Steel mini that then jumped into the Superman book, which started at number 1, but then the action continued. Its legacy numbering, but he's been on both. Now, just talking about the Superman book, like I said, you end up with Tomasi ending his run at issue number 45. And when that ended, it was selling 42,000 copies. Brian Michael Bendis comes on his Superman number 1. It's a number 1. That's going to go. It went up to 133,000. And yes, it did go down since. And it has gone down since. But 20 issues after Peter J. Tomasi's run ended at 42,000, you are only at 39,000 with Brian Michael Bendis. Not that much of a difference. Now, I do think that DC thought that when Bendis came over, they were going to just count the money. Count day money they were going to do. They were going to sleep on a bed of money with supermodels because they thought he was going to just breakout star again. This was going to recharge him and his fans. People were going to go nuts. It didn't quite work out that way. To me, the Wonder Comics imprint that he is kind of the head of bust. You end up with a lot of those books just low sellers. And they're quirky titles, but still low sellers. Even the idea of his Lois Lane that he got Greg Rucka to write, or the Remeder Jimmy Olsen book, those aren't selling either. So overall, I do think that he did not make the impact that they wanted. But you can't really sit there and tell me that Tomasi, if he would have stayed on Superman, 20 issues later would have only gone down 3,000 in sales. He would have went down a lot more. And that's just the case. If you want to point out that, well, and some people are going like, Tomasi's number 1 compared to Brian Michael Bendis' number 1 and going that. Now you end up, that's not apples and oranges, or it is, because Rebirth really, when Tomasi started with his number one Rebirth hit, all the books were selling well. I can sit there and go, the Flash book, as I said before, and go number one as opposed to number 62. And you'll just see that they've all gone down. I said Flash is now in the 20s. That's awful. And so I think that what's going on here is not just, oh my God, they're kicking off Brian Michael Bendis, which I don't mind because I don't like his writing. I don't like anything he's done at DC. That could be another podcast. Just the idea that I think he spends too much time trying to convince us DC fans that he knows DC, still messes it up and forgets to tell a story. Character work out there nowhere. I don't know what he's doing. So this is something that I am glad for. I want a change. And I think that one of the biggest problems was that you don't have an alternative. This is why people love the idea when Robert Venditti was doing that, Man of Tomorrow digital only book, because we actually got another perspective on the character. We actually could read somebody else, and whether or not you thought it was good or not, it's nice to have a change. It's nice to be able to have an alternative, especially Brian Michael Bendis. He's a polarizing guy. He really is. And if you don't like him, you don't have a super book. And also he has Legion and Young Justice and Naomi when he did, all of these things. Also, the Leviathan nonsense. And one of the things, again, if we're going to go to end this with a little bit of a Brian Michael Bendis roast, I mean, please don't use your big books, Superman Action Comics, just to push this nonsense in the other books. Keep them to those. They don't sell, and they're not making the super books sell any better either. It just ends up ridiculous. Plus, just John Romita Jr. should retire. There you go. That's it. That is it. But yeah, I just figured I'd talk a little about this, and maybe I'll do more of these type of things. This is just kind of off the cuff. I don't even have any sort of notes here. Maybe the next time I'll be more prepared. But I just wanted to, do this. And I am, if anybody is actually paying attention and wondering where the heck I've gone on the YouTube front, I'm going to start doing more videos starting this week. I have been tied up with our Patreon account and both our DC and Marvel Comics podcast, which I'll give a shout out. I'm on the Weird Science DC Comics podcast. You can look that up. And I'm on the Weird Science Marvel Comics podcast, which you can look up like that as well and find that we do a lot. We do a lot, but also our Patreon, patreon.com/Weird Science, where we do a ton of shows, about 80 exclusive shows a month on, older comics, new comics, even Kids with Rocks, everything. So go check those things out. I hope that you enjoyed this enough, just me kind of talking, but I will talk to you all later.